Hello YouTube, Wimian here. We are so back yet again with another Bots and Tops, where I review a music genre's releases over the course of a month, giving you an idea of what to skip over and what might be worth listening to. I will be as opinionated as ever, but for the month of April, we're getting into the modern classical genre. I will say these albums are pre-selected and not every release through April, but I wanted a fitting mix of worth and unworth albums, so I don't waste my time or yours. Classical tends to have more weirdos making music like avant-garde jazz, but I will always skip the dumb stuff to save both our sanities. Thanks for tuning in, and without anything more, let's start the show. Our first album comes from the composer Julius Aglinskas, titled Blue Dusk, and it's performed by a group named Apartment House. Despite their indie pop sounding name, Apartment House is a UK string quartet of great renown for their consistent solid work, especially in recent years. Their main practice is centered around chamber music and minimalism, but Julius brought them here for something more like an ambient project. If you don't know, ambient and chamber are closely related, but chamber isn't as restricted. It just means there's only a few performers in a little room, as opposed to a big composed orchestra. And that minimalism can really come together if you play it right. Without getting too caught up in myself, let's listen in. The first, basically the only chord progression, is decent, with strings naturally filling space for nice backing. I love the addition of brass to resolve without dragging the main melody alone for too long. The sonic filtering is ambient-esque, manipulates the peak volumes into waves, but adds the muffling to harder playing. This, again, works super well with the brass, bringing them closer to the strings and grinding something of an inversion to that melody. I was almost livid when the pause section came around 5 minutes in, but Julius truly does manage to keep the tempo he's been building. This part could have uniquely ruined the whole song, but the risk was worth the reward. The piano addition is outstanding too, really minimal and sticking to the range's notes, but there's a reason they accompany the strings so well. We get practically a return to the song's start for a reprise, and even faster to the pause section, breaking to a more emotional sweeping. They play it up though, and drag whatever they can from that emotion into a few extra minutes. Bonus points for adding what I assume is a classical guitar or something. They work just as well as pianos for plucking notes over top low harmonies. And of course, there's that filtering over everything, so the layered harmonies blend together nicely, though artificially. If it sounds good, I don't care. The guitar plays out to another outro pause, which I assume is the break for the second movement, being quite near halfway through the song. We're immediately called back to the prior melody, but I feel like the instruments are displayed in a better quality, especially the flutes and reeds, as if they were holding out on the first section. Just as the waves of the volume increase, the different instruments also come in waves, and each one has the same thing to say in a new way, nearly like jazz. Settling the instruments near the end goes nicely, and the guitar-piano combo is doing great work. Nothing too abrupt, and obviously nothing too crazy. The song itself doesn't really go anywhere, but the quality sound is what makes it good. I'm not sure this is worth 22 minutes, but that's just ambient. There's a whole other 14 minutes in the accompanying track, Blue Dusk 2. This one is a bit more unique, but still takes the same sound. Definitely recognizable as an addition to the first. The guitar comes in quite a bit earlier, and the strings have a faster melody to work subtle tempo changes into. Everything feels more tight and practiced. Resolving chords on the high notes is unusual given how well another low would work, but it gives room for the higher range instruments as well. The violins sound a little lost on their notes, but the backing can make up for it well enough. More annoying than the first track, given the high range. The volume is so much that there's little room for other players to shine, and the violins go on to take up a majority of the song. I might have liked this song without them because the lower notes are pretty banger, but the composer needs to chill on that shrill octave. The come down works it in a bit better, but by the time the song is ending, I'm already sick of that whine they're so desperate to have. Well, this work has more than a few shortcomings, especially in the second part. The quality of the first makes up for whatever I didn't end up liking. Starting off strong, Blue Dusk is going into the tops. Next up is Kalia Vandever's We Fell in Turn. Kalia is from Brooklyn and only truly started making music in May 2022 with a jazz album titled Regrowth. This received decent reviews, and nearly a decade later, she's returned with a more classically centered album. Still adding a little bit of jazz, We Fell in Turn is primarily a trombone work because she's a trombonist. This is seemingly self-produced, so I don't expect much, but I do have some expectations. Let's see how Kalia does. Track 1 is titled Recollections from Shore, setting the tone for the rest of the album. The brass is the most integral part and will appear just as frequently in every song. The reverb is nice, and nothing really breaks my ears, taking on the low ambient drone. It sounds like their goal is to tone it around enough to replace synthesizers for an electronic style, and the trombone itself is soft enough to easily transition to synths, or work alongside them. This has some jazz flair too, but that could just be the indie composer choosing some atonal notes and progressions. This is a solid intro, really encompassing their sound. Track 2 is Imagine Being Told, basically a trombone solo that just plays around a few scales. This comes off as a warm-up track where you're finding the possible ranges or what buttons make what notes. Nothing crazy or unique, and definitely not as good as the intro, with the same amount of mistakes. But this does make for a solid transition track, being not too long. Track 3 is Stillness in Hand, taking us into a simpler 4/4 chill track. The synth application works best here in my opinion, taking it just far enough to be modern electronic, but keeping the unique solo over top with more of that drone returning. Real, solid, modern classical. Not a masterpiece, but I wish this were longer than the last track. Track 4 is Mirrored Solitude, bringing in a series of high vocal notes on different tracks, where each track is set for pitch bending. If you've seen the prior episodes, you'll know I'm really not a fan of the pitch bend gimmick, but I will try to ignore it for the better parts of each song. The tuning does have great quality for being so minimal, and it's not so obnoxious that it drowns out the song. I can at least say each track here seems to have great mixing, with a lot of time put into it. However, that cheap bend to shift the entire tone at 1:30 is too much to ignore, making this a bot track on the album. The trombone isn't the best either, but at least they're droning along to the vocals. Track 5 is titled Center, again with the immense reverb on a trombone solo. You might throw this one out, but I think this has a unique quality that the others don't. The wide shifts between octaves eventually lend to a low drone, which sounds a lot like strings with the method of tuning. I'm sure it's just another detuned trombone, but the solo on the high range is doing a lot better, and it works great with the low note, even if it takes the whole track. Track 6 is Temper the Wound, giving a more synth-pop style, especially with the backing now droning out high notes. The trombone is a bit much, but they definitely work together as an accompaniment. Nothing bends or detunes too much, and again, the whole album has great attention to mixing. This is a 50-50 track for me. Either you'll like it or not, but it's definitely not a flop. Track 7 is Teased Traces, with the insane reverb on the trombone backing out into a more atonal melody, but the two reverbed notes eventually bend to meet and provide a new core for the trombone. It sounds as though there is actually a reverb pedal with a looper, because other notes would take that same harshness but don't fade out forever. There's a lot of simple tricks that make up tracks like these, but again, this sounds no better than practicing on equipment. At least to me, there might be some people who like it, but I would look at them judgingly. Track 8 is Held In, taking it much slower with a more minimal style between the 2 octaves, droning without the extra electronic tuning except the standard EQ filter from every other song, but that filter makes this a Kalia Vandever song, and I enjoy what they're laying down. This track doesn't have the real ending it deserves, again working as a transition yet left without even a resolve. It deserved just a few more seconds, but it's another solid 50-50 accompaniment. Second to last is track 9, titled We Wept in Turn. This is a weaker track for me personally, going back to the testing out buttons and random chord progressions, and using much more of that pitch bending. The backing is just a bit too loud, drowning out the highs from the impressively mid-solo. Nothing really changes, and you might be able to fall asleep to this song, but I haven't tried yet. Finally is track 10, titled Unfaltering. This turned out better than I hoped, but still has the trouble combining the rhythm and melody in that indie way. They line up enough that it's solid, but I doubt much actual composition went into this album. As I said, this sounds practically no different than track 1. If you've come this far in, you'll probably enjoy the outro. It's, again, minimal with the chord progression, but the fade-out reverb makes for a unique enough ending. This album is unfortunately a bot for me, because even with the outstanding short tracks and some hints of inspiration here or there, there's just not enough to outshine the dragging bulk of the songs. I'll say it's very close, and I know there's better yet to come from Kalia, but We Fell in Turn falls in the bots. Next, we have Neil Cowley for his newest album, Battery Life. Neil is more of an ambient electronic producer, but it's impossible to avoid classical between those two. He's worked with more than a few groups since '97, getting his first hint of fame in 2004 as the Rhodes piano for 07's ambient downtempo album When It Falls, and really busting out as Adele's pianist for hits such as Rolling in the Deep, 19, and 21. With this new success, Neil recently restarted his own solo career in 2021 alongside his old friend Tom Jones, but he hasn't been seen in any work since then. Until now, right here. Look at this, Neil Cowley's Battery Life. Let's get into it. Track 1 is titled I Must Be Liked, showcasing a great sense of rhythm as if it's actually composed. The backing follows in solid scales with outstanding attention to detail on the reverb and tuning. This is some hot, modern classical that I'm not sure I'm qualified to review without music theory, but I will try my best. The tone does shift more electronic with a very low drum beat to back the piano, low enough that the piano can drown out the drums, which is preferable to the opposite. There's this unique ethereal electric sound shifting positions between ears, making this a hidden synth pop shadow agent banger. Later on is some bleeps and boops syncopated with the drums to make a nice little dance beat, but that's just modern classical. It seems Neil really knows the genre he's making, and with such prior history, even this first track shows off what practice and dedication can amount to. Track 2 is Automata, coming in with the bird song and electric backing, still keeping minimal and ambient. Somehow this is a step up from the intro, and it's a real banger for the album. I've been personally looking for something like this style, and Neil is worth my playlist. It's a little experimental, but that tends to make for a unique modern classical. My only possible complaint is it drags on a bit, but there's nothing about this song I dislike, and it could have been on the Nier Automata OST. Track 3 is Breaka with an A. This takes on a more mellow jazz piano with the outstanding electronics again. More of a persona acid jazz track than classical, but this vibes no less than the last track. With 5 minutes on here, some of these tracks are expected to drag on a bit, but We know it's expected for ambient, let alone classical. We eventually progress back to composed instruments, namely chimes and tuned synths, but all in all, he's still making bangers with this one. Track 4 is Ticker Tape, taking the piano much bolder and playing around a reverb pattern. The density of the notes lends to a great transition to synth pop, and the pattern isn't lost for a beat with different octaves. The density of the notes lends to a great transition to synth pop, and the pattern isn't lost for a beat. With different octaves, this could be a dance song, but everything blends together too well at the center to give just a hint of house. All the other tracks here are less than 5 minutes, but Ticker Tape doesn't feel rushed at all because of its detailed production. Track 5 is Arkansas, or Arkansas, coming back to the minimal piano and much softer backing. There isn't much progression, being just a bit over 2 minutes, but this is a real hot interlude. I personally seek out high-quality interludes for background music, and this is not even close to a skip. Arkansas might even be my favorite on the album, but I've only had 3 listen-throughs. If you pick one track to try, this is the one. Track 6 is Personal Effects, which is absolutely bringing us to the dance house territory. We're given light drums in 4/4 with a kick deep enough to be an 808. As always, the tuning is phenomenal, and the structure has been raked over for mistakes many times. I typically hate this style, but Neil truly pulls it off in that synth-pop fashion. The production is just too good to pass up, and that's the beauty of a modern classical influence. Track 7 is Telegrams, taking the same dense drum beat into what sounds like an improvised rendition. More abstract rhythms and progressions, but still recognizable as something like house. This type of tight modern classical was more common before 2010 when most artists switched to making full dance music, but I'm glad to see it return to some more ambient style. Track 8 is Scarab Beetle, where if you don't like the starting melody, you won't like the rest. And I'm, unfortunately, one of those people. I'm sorry, but there was bound to be one mid-track, and it's not like it's low quality, but it's just abstract enough to be too much. Still, it's very unique, with some great bits to it, but it's something I'd expect to hear from an indie game trailer. Next to last is track 9, Life on Silent. This is my other contender for favorite on the album, coming back with a straight banger after last track. The drums aren't overpowering beyond ambient, we have that same minimal style, and the reverbed piano and synths bring that classical synth pop. The refrain is what puts this above Arkansas, making the extra length worth your time. This one is going in my yearly playlist, and I doubt I'll forget it soon. The outro is track 10, titled Chord. This takes a darker tone of truly classical piano, with a low synth acting as the occasional humming drum between movements. A bit more abstract at the end, but this truly encompasses each style explored from the album, making for a great outro. There's not much more I can say, with only one mid-track and an album full of bangers. Neil Cowley's Battery Life is a top contender for my cyberpunk book reading playlist. Next is an album with just as interesting origins, titled August Dreams. This is a work conducted by pianist Richard Carr, joined by Caleb Burnens on violin and Clarice Jensen on cello, with each responsible for electronic tuning. This is what true chamber music is about, just some random players getting together. But what if these weren't random players? Richard Carr is a member of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra, but his real claim to fame was his first performance in 1989 and 2003 as a viola player for the rock band Swans. Imagine being this guy in 2023, really. But Richard wasn't the only one with such a status. In 2006 and 2008, Caleb Burnens was the strings for Brooklyn indie rock band The Hold Steady. 2 years later, he was in with the strings on Arcade Fire's The Suburbs, leading into work in 2012 with the Indietronica Passion Pit, post-rock mono, a little dip in 2018 with Yoko Ono, viola for the Joker film in 2019, all the way leading to now. It's quite a mouthful, but that's just an idea of where Caleb Burnens is coming from. Clarice Jensen is no exception to the two, and may in fact be the most popular. Her solo work started around 2018, but experience runs deeper, as usual. Her first breakout role was in 2005 as assistant conductor for a film soundtrack titled The Music from Drawing Restraint 9. To make sure you remember this detail forever, that soundtrack's lead producer is Bjork, and this was the album she traveled to Japan to learn about their ancient music and instruments. It's not the best, but a decent start for Clarice nonetheless. After this, she made it onto the same cruise as Caleb with Arcade Fire, Passion Pit, Mono, Max Richter, and Joker, but that's where they split. I will shit you not, Clarice is the one and only cello player from Taylor Swift's new era, starting from Folklore. Fans of the channel should know the last album I liked from her was Reputation, so we'll see if it's all Clarice's fault here. With these two performers stealing the spotlight a bit, let's get into the work at hand by Richard Carr, August Dreams. Track 1 is Sun Ritual, immediately bringing us to the ambient chamber. There's a lot of low humming and slow progressions, but the instruments are crystal clear and well composed. Woodwinds and strings with what might be a violin towards the middle, no harsh brass or Viking battle music. Droning is used to expand and explore notes, sticking around a few chords played downward. Not too long and great for driving music, this is a decent ambient intro from the trio. Track 2 is On the Shoulders of Giants, bringing in some synchronous chimes, blending their high-pitched tunes together. Eventually, the tuning turns electronic, which adds a flair I didn't expect, but it's great for a unique additive of ambient. The strings return again from the lows, bringing an equal contrast to the chimes playing out, but the outstanding tuning continues. The song does eventually become a bit more impressionist than minimal chamber, and isn't quite as ambient, but it's still a strong, solid performance. Track 3 is Césaire, or Caesar, or Kesser, but I digress. This starts us with a focus on lower strings, returning that violin progression from the intro, and still sounding just as good. A lower hum is added as backing to give the highs opportunity to explore more, but this is overall just a standard solid strings track. There's lots of solo material, and it might drag on a bit, so it's probably not the best on here. Track 4 is Satellite, with another nice ambient use of panning and tuning. They add an authentic bass, which is still a string, meaning it works that much better with their violin core. This is much more somber and focuses on deep droning for movements. It does get old after a while of not reiterating and using the same bass line forever, but there is a nice expansion as the song ends. With such length, and just to ruin the closing with their uniqueness, Satellite is very close to being a top track, but the cons outweigh the pros here. Track 5 is Overnight Crossing, immediately bringing back that deep bass for another go. Other instruments cover the high range, like chimes, but this shows off electronic tuning and reverb on something like woodwinds and a xylophone. This is a decent start, but they revert to the played-out violin solo by the end. Track 6 is Kindness, just starting us with the high tunes. The melody is nearly from Chrono Trigger, or it could be the instrument sounding so close. More plucking on the strings, but the violin is still here to drag out notes. The plucks have some volume problem, and they sound too raw, so they could definitely use some more mixing. But the song in itself isn't too bad, until we're back to the violin drowning out the backing to play another improv solo. Track 7 is The Birch Tree, which just starts us off with the solo and never ends. This is bait for what classical should sound like, struggling to convey any sort of emotion from start to finish. Something is just not working out between the players, trying to take such strong solos while the backing is moping in a corner waiting to come back. This just made me feel sad, but you might feel different. Track 8 is Merritt Parkway, where we get that plucking back with a nice melody behind them and a duller sound this time around. This sounds more relaxed and composed thanks to the removal of the violin, still struggling for coherent emotion with such improv-sounding composition, but most of the shortcomings in kindness are accounted for in Merritt Parkway. Track 9 is Figures in White, another bait track that makes me sick to listen to. Deliberately avoiding any sort of backing and restraining notes to short bursts the whole time while also messing up the plucks again is absolutely not my style. Track 10 is Deep in the Seventh, finally giving that deep bassy string at the start. It could be a cello or something upright since it's got some size behind it. Out of this low backing, they develop a decent melody into the midtones, adding cymbals and drums for the high range, much like a post-rock song. The moment they break, it becomes obvious how riddled with programming each instrument here is. Like true electronic, they cannot afford a drum set, nor likely many of the sampled instruments. Track 11 is Moderate Swells, another bait with an awful solo, which we thankfully don't have to worry about since next song is the last. Track 12 is When It's Time to Go, giving us a funky little tropical dance beat with that violinist just trying their hardest to break their strings. I'd like to say it's super easy to dance and groove to, but I'm sorry. Nobody is digging your rhythm here. What started out as a promising album soon devolved into a bag of played-out tricks where they dumped the entire bag in the first few tracks. I find it hard to believe these three worked on the album, let alone thought it sounded good. They could just be another group who wants to break the boundaries of classical by playing the wrong notes. This was a bot listen, but the potential for real music is there. Next up is Thomas Adès' Dante, as performed by Los Angeles Philharmonic. Such a prestigious orchestra really needs no introduction. These are some of the best players in the world for consistent quality orchestral music. If you're unfamiliar with the style, this is more of a ballet classical with battle music and some softer parts with inquisitive sections, all aligning with the themes of the interpreted work, the Divine Comedy. As such, this work is split into three parts of Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Each is about 10 tracks long, so for time's sake, I'll just summarize my thoughts on the three. First, we have Inferno, starting with some strong, fitting movements and becoming more gentle like a good composer knows. A major benefit of having a popular composed work is there's such a low chance for disrespectful quirks in the production, especially with an orchestra as composed as this. On a first listen through, this certainly sounds like if Through the Fire and the Flames were classical and half an hour long. Lots of technically tough little pieces, and there's so much to remember I'd guess it's impossible to play without reading a sheet. The players take it in stride though, and make this an impressive official recording of the album. Another major benefit is getting this beautiful sound quality with hi-fi equipment as opposed to the old muddy orchestras, so these modern reimaginations of older pieces can be a real blessing, even if you heard them before. Without much knowledge of theory, I can't really criticize this beyond sounding good or bad, and it's good to me so far. Lots of light, dark, and powerful movements, getting a bit more chaotic as we near part 2. Part 2 is Purgatorio, welcoming us with vocals and the darker style as opposed to the grand entrance introduction. More jazz influence as it progresses, but ultimately classical, with great layering of the vocals between the instruments. These were written as well as Inferno, and the players understand what they're trying to play with obvious practice. Most of these movements use the same tricks, but Purgatorio takes on a bit more density and difficulty with pieces, switching tempos more often and such. Part 3 is Paradiso, which has movements titled after planets, more concerning the ballet style. Again, there's nothing here sticking out to me as bad, and I might even believe these are danceable. The tone starts pretty light and fun, but it gets more dark toward the middle. Nearing the end, the movements strike me as reflective on the journey and issues some callbacks to past motifs as the book would itself. The actual end is what you could expect, with a small twist to leave a lasting impression from the composer. Thomas Adès made a great work here, and I was glad to listen to the Los Angeles Philharmonic perform it. A few of these songs might even make my playlist, and while I wouldn't call a majority bangers, I found this near impossible to criticize. This was a top listen for sure. Next on the block is something like a split EP titled Elaine Radigue by Ensemble Daedalus and Ryoko Akama. This album is a bit more unique, with only 2 works, each lasting nearly half an hour, and it's divided between the 2 performers. The first, Ensemble Daedalus, is based in France with nearly 10 members, but not a lot of experience. The second, Ryoko Akama, has quite a bit of work behind her starting from 2015, practicing mainly reductionism and drone. You will find both tracks are very similar, yet each are able to show their unique talents, especially with Ryoko's analog synths and sine waves. Ensemble Daedalus can get lowercase sometimes, but each are trying their best at microtonal classical on here. Without much more to say, let's get into it. The first track is Occam Hepta I, or 1, and starts us off with 1 note. This 1 note plays for a while, and then it doesn't stop. It's really the whole song, and absolutely, if you're not a fan, you won't like it. But a song like this is the epitome of why I say that. There's quite a bit of exploration, although it's in that slow droning ambient style, and though everything aligns on that single note, the musicality comes from ever so slightly adding and reducing the instruments in harmony. That's what microtonal is all about, and Ensemble Daedalus is experienced enough to know what they're making. At about 6 minutes, I started getting a little bored, but carried on. 10 minutes later, I thought it was a little funny how long this 1 note could go, but nothing crazy happened. Further near the end, we get a little deviation, but still in the way of instruments, not notes. The end comes as expected, and I'm glad it didn't drag any farther. For an ambient work of this size and nature, half an hour is standard, and I'd call this overall solid. Again, there's not much to work with or criticize, and while I was searching for something strange to happen, I didn't feel the need to skip this. It was pretty solid. Track 2 is Occam XX, which I believe is 20, again using a single note. This one has a bit higher octave, which could lend to a preference of electronic styles, but it's generally the same. An ambient work in the chamber style with enough reduction to sound near microtonal like last track. But near the half point and the end, we get quite a bit more deviation. They almost start playing different notes, and maybe it's there in the backing, but that core is never lost the entire time. Out of the pure simplicity in both of these tracks, I couldn't find any fatal flaws in either one, making this a shocking top album. I wouldn't listen to it every day, but these 2 notes will stick with me for a while, and I might even come back sometime. Finally is a rendition of one of minimalism's finest scores, Music for 18 Musicians by Steve Reich, as performed by the Colin Currie group and Synergy Vocals. Both have worked together extensively to make chamber and microtonal work since 2002, and restarting their careers in 2016. Synergy Vocals' first album came in 2021 as a highly regarded totalism work, so while both of these groups are in a way quite new, they've earned their right to play this piece. This is the longest track list with 14 total, so without taking too much time, let's get into it. Track 1, titled Pulses, takes on a fast tempo of various attacking strings to match the choral vocals, much like Pulses. These play into prominence by the middle and have decent expansion on chord progressions while maintaining the same rhythm throughout. Nothing too wild here, but not ambient either. This is standard classical that keeps out the droning. It's not the best, and I don't exactly prefer choirs, but overall solid for an introduction. it does make me want to hear what they have next. Track 2 is Section 1, which counts up until the final track 14, so I won't restate it every time. The faster paced notes are still here, but with less of a pulsing behind them and just playing a rhythm. The droning notes are introduced with the high instruments, as any standard composer would. The choral backing is doing a lot of the work, but the reserved highs bring out whatever chimes or flutes are added in. More harmony is added as we reach the middle, but they're still sticking to that core progression. The minimal additions come off as great taste to me, and this is another faultless track. If you like the melody, you'll like the rest. Section 2 is brought by a flawless transition from the first fading into the high notes, and the melody changes to a higher toned alternative of the same arpeggio melody. Slowly, we're given the first sounds of brass, though very light, maybe just a few trumpets playing in syncopation with the melody to give it a more unique flair. With an expansion on the xylophone, we also have the pulsing strings return, which you will see more frequently as bringing out the electronic style. It does lend for easier blending as the arpeggiated melodies overlap and add on itself, so you nearly don't notice the slow change. Nearing the end, this song overall takes on a sound much like Pulse's, but I think this section does it a bit better. Really no faults again, and I'm starting to really respect Steve Reich. Section 3A transitions in smoothly, much like the last, keeping that same little melody about 10 minutes in like quality minimalist classical. Soon enough, the strings are allowed to expand a bit higher, and the new melody has a much stronger emotional impact after being allowed to develop for so long. The pulsing choir is back, but it's really outshined by the instruments. Eventually, we do return to the prior melody, and they let it run until nearing the end when it dips lower instead of focusing on the highs. It's a decent enough ending to wrap up, but I doubt this melody will survive 4 sections. None of these are bad, but I'm getting a little tired of it by now. Section 3B does bring in different notes, but it's the same melody out of smooth transition yet again. More unique, coming in with the allowance of high notes to drown the melody, but they're playing in sync to the same BPM yet again soon enough. The pulsing vocals come in near the middle, and I wonder if they always need the rhythm like this because the choir can only pulse their voices in a single BPM. At this point, Section 3B is a not good from me. Section 4 takes the beginning a bit higher with the same rhythm. The pulsing strings are brought back, as well as the vocals, and mixing the two just ruins both for me. This is more like a Christmas version of the last songs, where instruments are only capable of short progressions, and trying to keep it a little jazzy, but it still really doesn't work. I need something new at this point because the same little arpeggio with different notes is not cutting it. Section 5 brings us right back to the same melody, but instead we're given pianists with schizophrenia going off on highs and lows respectively. They do find the middle ground near the middle, opening up better room for the pulsing strings to return, and the low vocals deviating in melody helps the backing a lot. I'm still giving this track a pass since it's still the same exact rhythm and refuses to deviate. If there wasn't a note on every beat, I might enjoy it, but I can't stand this metronome running in the background for every song. Section 6 gives us basically the same with a full band version. Lots more work into the production of this one for essentially the same section. There's enough deviation here that it could easily be your favorite of the last 5, and I wouldn't blame you. With promise of doing better on the next track, Section 6 is surprisingly as good as the earlier ones, and I'll give them a plus for this one. It'll be hard to pull back my favor, so we'll see the next ones. Section 7 is a better version of Section 4, but still basically the same, and still fails to pass the saving throw versus my ears. Section 8 is the same as 7, but a little higher and more minimal. The vocals are mostly dropped, allowing the xylophone to just go off on that core melody like 45 minutes later, because this is the one that's gonna hit. I am not sure if it's how they're written or how they're playing, but the songs really just sound like practice for tuning instruments. Section 9 is a bit different, starting on a low note, but this quickly turns to a little fun track for the vocalist to go up and down really fast on. I'd love to say it works together beautifully, but this is still bogus, refusing to take the sound anywhere beyond the start. Section 10 brings back the schizophrenic pianist, and I'm now realizing those low pulsing strings only ever come in 2 notes. So they might not actually have players, and they're just pitch tuning a sample they recorded one time. This is, again, unimpressive. Section 11 brings it all around, nearing the end by playing the same exact melody as the start. This is a common trope for many albums, but it's not common to play the same exact thing the entire way through a piece. At this point, they can't possibly play anything new, but they're still playing anyways, as if it matters. I either feel bad for Steve Reich that these players did so poorly, or feel bad for the players that Steve Reich was an awful composer, but I won't know until I hear his other renditions. Not to end too early, we wrap it up with Pulses 2 on track 14. This fades out the instruments for the most part, and leaves it up to the pulsing vocals, which I still don't like. Finally coming to an end, and while having a strong start, the complete lack of deviation in the melody puts this work as a bot listen. You're better off finding someone else's version. And with that concludes our bots and tops for April 2023. For a quick recap, the bots were Kalia Vandever's We Fell in Turn, Richard Carr's August Dreams, and Colin Currie Group's Music for 18 Musicians. The tops were Neil Cowley's Battery Life, Los Angeles Philharmonic's Dante, Blue Dusk by Julius Aglinskas and Apartment House, and finally the surprising Elaine Radigue by Ensemble Daedalus and Ryoko Akama. This was a pretty nice half and half, but with many albums unavailable for streaming or simply not worth my time, the selection here is a little biased. I didn't want to take up avant-garde jazz and get in over my head, but we're definitely going with a simple genre in June. As always, if you have recommendations for a genre I haven't covered, leave a quick comment because I always read them. Make sure you subscribe to see the next spots and tops, but for now, this is Wimyan, signing off.